On the 9th of April 1483 is where our story begins, a look back in time at a medieval mystery, a mystery that remains unsolved even to this day. With the death of King Edward IV, he'd left behind two sons, Edward aged 12 and Richard just 9. Both boys were put under the protectorship of Edward's brother Richard, the Duke of Gloucester. But lurking in the shadows was his sworn enemy, Henry Tudor, a man who posed a massive threat. It's a tale of terror that leads us to the Tower of London, once the home of monarchs in England at that time. It's a battle for survival, a tale of intrigue, of kidnap and murder. But who are the suspects and what was the motivation behind the internment of these boys? Join me now as we look at the story of the princes in the Tower. Edward IV died on the 9th of April 1483. He left his sons Richard and his elder brother Edward, who would now become the new King Edward V. Edward stayed at Lille Castle while the dead king's brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was spending time in Yorkshire at Lambert Castle. On the 15th of April, Gloucester found out about the death. He then travelled to York Minster to pledge his loyalty to his new king. When the two of them eventually set out for London, it would be at a place called Stony Stratford that they would meet up on the 29th of April. After their initial talks, the following day Gloucester rounded up Anthony Woodville, 2nd Earl Rivers, along with Sir Richard Grey. These two were part of Edward IV's crew, but he sent the men to Pontefract Castle, where they would be executed on the 25th of June. He would also now place his arm around Prince Edward, and it looked unlikely that Edward was going anywhere fast. This news created panic for Elizabeth Woodville, who fled to sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her son Richard, Duke of York, and her daughters. When both Edward V and Gloucester arrived in London, they set plans for Edward's coronation. He would stay at the Tower of London. In those times, the Tower was a residence for monarchs. Edward IV trusted his brother Richard to do the right thing. Richard even swore an oath to protect his nephews. However, things were now moving at pace. On the 16th of June, Edward was joined by his younger brother Richard at the Tower. On the 22nd of June, a sermon by Dr. Ralph Shaw, who was brother to the Lord Mayor, proclaimed that Gloucester was the only legitimate heir to the House of York. By June the 25th, a group of knights and lords declared that Gloucester should take the throne. Both princes were then declared illegitimate by Parliament. They also stated that the marriage of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville was invalid due to a pre-contract made with Lady Eleanor Butler. On the 3rd of July, Gloucester was crowned King Richard III. At this point, the boys were still looked upon as royalty, but soon that would change and they would become prisoners. It was recorded by an Italian friar, Dominic Mancini, that Richard seized the throne. As for Edward and his younger brother Richard, they were taken to the Tower and placed in apartments. The two were seen less and less over the coming days until one day they just disappeared entirely. Mancini said that Edward regularly had a visit by a doctor, who then reported his demeanour was at a low ebb, yet he confessed his sins daily and believed that death was nearing. Other reports suggest the two princes were seen within the Tower grounds playing, but after the summer of 1483, there were no further sightings. It remains a mystery and one that's still unresolved. Historians believe that the boys had been murdered. One suggestion is that a rebellion against Richard in 1483 was aimed at rescuing Edward V and his brother. However, the Duke of Buckingham became involved, and at that point it looks pretty likely that both boys had already been murdered. The rebellion force, reluctant to take it any further at this stage, decided to support Henry Tudor in his quest to remove Richard III from power. Although the princes had vanished, there is no evidence to suggest they were murdered. Neither do the theories give a clear view of what's happened. The nearest anyone can get to the truth is an account by the aforementioned Dominic Mancini, which by the way was not discovered until 1934 in Lille at the Municipal Library. Accounts written after the disappearance are spurious and quite possibly based solely on propaganda coming out of the House of Tudor. Over the years, 4 unidentified bodies have been found at the Tower of London, all considered to be from this period. 2 of the 4 in the Tower and the others were at St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. As of yet, authorities have declined submissions to have them interred, along with DNA tests conducted to try and form a positive identity. Rumours of the tragedy have constantly circulated, from their time of disappearing to the modern day, and some have even travelled across the Channel to France. It would be in January of 1484 that Guillaume de Rochefort, the Lord Chancellor of France, urged the Estates General to take warning from the fate of the princes, as their King Charles VIII was only 13. Many at the court believed that Richard III killed them before seizing the throne in England, but in a book entitled the De Commun Memoire around 1500, it states that the Duke of Buckingham was the real culprit. Interestingly, the only possible and plausible account is by Mancini. Two articles, one in the Croyland Chronicle and the other French report, were both written sometime after the event. It's been suggested the Croyland article may have been influenced by the then Archbishop of Canterbury, John Morton, to try and incriminate Richard III. But one fascinating theory comes from the pen of Thomas More. It's a fact that Thomas grew up in the household of John Morton, who, as we know, was unhappy with Richard. In his writings, he identified Sir James Tyrrell as behind the murder, or acted upon an order from Richard. Tyrrell was a very loyal servant to Richard. It's even said that Tyrrell confessed to the murders before his execution for treason in 1502. Thomas More said that the princes were smothered in their beds by two people who were agents of Tyrrell. One was Miles Forrest and the other John Dighton. More claims that the bodies were buried at the foot of some stairs, deep into the ground and covered with stones, yet later disinterred and moved to a secret location. The Tower of London holds many secrets from its past. However, one was discovered in 1674 when a group of workmen dug up a wooden box. Inside it contained two skeletons. They had found the box under a staircase that led to the White Tower. This, however, wasn't the first discovery of children's remains at the tower, as others had been found in an old chamber that had been bricked up. The reason it was said to be the remains of the princes was purely based on the account of Thomas More. However, this does not match, as the staircase where these bones were found was not built at the time of Richard III. 4 years after the discovery, Charles II had the bones placed in an urn and reinterred at Westminster Abbey. Within the wall of Henry VII Lady Chapel, a monument was erected by Christopher Wren, marking the resting place of the assumed princes. In 1933, these bones were removed and examined by Lawrence Tanner, an archivist at the time, Professor William Wright, anatomist, and George Northcroft, who was president of the Dental Association. They concluded that they were, in fact, bodies of two small children who would have been around the age of the princes when they disappeared. The parts that remained were in poor condition due to the workmen who had literally just stumbled across them. Many bones were missing, including the lower jaw and all the teeth from the more significant subject. Yet, criticism would follow. Many said that the men who had done preparatory work on the bones had not even determined whether they were from a male or a female, and the exercise was a whitewash which just looked to implicate the princes on flimsy evidential work. Since that point, no further scientific work has been carried out on these remains, and although even with modern DNA and carbon dating techniques, it's quite possible it could prove the bones did indeed belong to the princes, but it would be unlikely to show any evidence of how they died or who killed them. Our following location is St George's Chapel, Windsor. In 1789, workers were carrying out repairs when they accidentally broke into the vault containing Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. At the time, a small adjoining vault was spotted, and within that another two bodies were found. They both seemed to harbour the bones of small children, yet both were unidentifiable, and no examination was carried out, and the tomb was resealed. This particular part of the plot is intriguing. The tomb they discovered had inscribed the names of two of Edward IV's children, one being George, the 1st Duke of Bedford, who died at the age of 2, and the other of Mary of York, who was only 14 when she passed away. However, the two lead coffins of George and Mary had already been found elsewhere within the chapel. So whose bodies had the workers discovered? Let's move forward to the 1990s. Workers excavated an area of St George's Chapel. The intention was to replace an old boiler and add a new repository for the deans and canons of Windsor. Requests were made to use a fibre optic camera to explore the Edward IV vault, and if possible to examine the unknown coffins which were inside, but to do this, royal consent would be required. In 2012, an archaeological dig resumed great interest in the prince's story. The remains had been found of Richard III in Leicester, and this opened up the theories again, and now there might be an opportunity to discover more, but Queen Elizabeth II refused. Richard III had always been the likeliest candidate for the prince's disappearance, even though Richard had removed both of them from the line of succession, but his hold on the crown had always been insecure, due to the way he had initially gained it. After an attempt was made to rescue the boys, it's clear that Richard thought these two were a threat for as long as they were both alive. A rebellion could have been raised and used the boys as an objective to remove Richard, and rumours once again continued in 1483 when it's now considered they had both died. The reasoning behind this is that Richard never allowed them to be seen in public. Another evidential account suggests Richard was away at the time, and this left the boys in the tower under his orders. Still, visitations were strictly limited, and even then only under the charge of Richard himself. He could have got someone to do the deed for him, but again this would only have occurred with his prior knowledge. The man from the account of Thomas More was indeed described as the killer of the princes. Tyrrell was a knight who had fought for the House of York, but he was arrested by Henry VII's forces in 1502. More described that Tyrrell shortly confessed to the murders with the help of two other men just before his execution, but this had been on the orders of Richard III, although he then went on to claim he did not know where the bodies were buried. Our third suspect was Richard's right-hand man, although Henry Stafford's guilt would depend on specific circumstances surrounding the event, as Henry himself was executed in November 1483. He had motives, being a descendant of Edward III on his father's side through John of Gaunt, the 1st Duke of Lancaster, along with Thomas of Woodstock, the 1st Duke of Gloucester, and the son of John of Gaunt, again called John on his mother's side. Buckingham may have had hopes of becoming monarch himself over time, but Richard stood in the way for now. Yet Henry, who had rebelled against Richard, which led to his death, was quite possibly unhappy at Richard's orders to carry out the murders, and this swayed him in his loyalty to Richard. So did Henry, on orders from Richard, kill the princes? And we must also ask another question. If Henry had carried out the crime, why did Richard not openly talk about this to clear his own name from the proceedings? And for this reason alone, it's pretty positive Henry would never have carried out this act without Richard's collaboration. Following Henry Tudor's claim to the throne in England, it is said that some other claimants to the throne were executed. One of these was a John of Gloucester, an illegitimate son of Richard III. Now, although Henry was away from England at the prince's disappearance, in which case his only opportunity to have murdered them would have been after 1485 on his accession to the throne, Henry has never been accused of the murders. However, the boys certainly posed a threat to Henry Tudor. His claim to the throne would certainly be weakened if they had survived. He even married Edward IV's daughter, Elizabeth of York, and brought all her remaining children into the line of succession. But at this point the princes were already dead, so it seemed like a win-win situation for the new Tudor king. But there simply was no evidence, and if it had been the case, I'm sure he would have produced the bodies and quickly laid the blame at Richard III's door. John Howard, the 1st Duke of Norfolk, had been implicated. Margaret Beaufort was another, as Henry VII's mother, and even Jane Shore, who was a mistress to Edward IV. But as with these and other theories, none can be taken seriously. The major stumbling block with any other but Richard carrying out the crime would have had to be done with Richard's order and knowledge, and the central fact is that Richard was responsible for the safekeeping of these boys. So who did it? Numerous notable people have all guessed who did this awful crime. However, did a crime even take place? During the reign of Henry VII, two people came forward claiming to be Richard, Duke of York. One of these was Lambert Simnel, yet he changed his story again and then claimed he was Edward Plantagenet, the 17th Earl of Warwick. Another bold man came forward, this time Perkin Warbeck. He made the same claim as Lambert. He was saying, while in Ireland, that he was in fact King Richard IV. This is now where it gets confusing, and that's if you're not already confused. Margaret of York had formally recognised Warbeck as Richard. However, Margaret, who was Richard III's sister, also recognised Lambert as Warwick. Warbeck had been accepted as Richard IV by James IV in Scotland, but after an attempt to invade England, he had been captured, at which point he retracted his claims, he was imprisoned and later executed. Yet this would now open a large can of worms. Two people who had insisted they were someone else caused many problems, and even in the 18th century the writer Horace Walpole argued that Richard had escaped death and that Warbeck was the genuine Richard. Although this statement was removed by Walpole later, and he succumbed to the majority in believing that Richard III was the man behind this dreadful crime. Whether it was a political move or one of pure hate, the reasons and more importantly, what happened to these boys is still a mystery. Richard has been blamed for the whole sorry saga, and even if he wasn't the man who carried out what is thought to be murder, you could quite possibly believe that he had some sway in the outcome. It doesn't seem very incredible that Richard thought removing these two boys would somehow shield his self-preservation, and even to the point of allowing his detractors to become acceptable of his own misdemeanours. But it would be Henry Tudor who was the man to remove Richard finally. Rebels joined Henry in overthrowing this most feared man. Richard had been labelled as the usurper to the throne and the murderer of the young princes. It seems the powers that be would do anything to help Henry take the throne and remove once and for all a king who has caused more destruction and death than ever could be imagined. The recriminations were swift. Richard was dead, but the theories and ongoing speculation about what happened to these two young princes was just beginning. Thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it. For more amazing stories, join me today and benefit by subscribing, and check out both the videos coming up on the screen right now. And I'll see you all again here soon on the History Roadshow.